Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Vaughn Scribner, and I'm really excited to chat today with Dr. Manisha Sin. We're going to talk with Manisha about her new book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. First, I want to introduce Dr. Sin. Dr. Sinha is the James L. and Shirley A. Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and the president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She was born in India, received her PhD from Columbia University, where her dissertation was nominated for the Bancroft Prize. She's the author of two other books, The Slave's Cause and The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, both of which won various prizes and awards and were favorably reviewed in top outlets. Honestly, her awards, positions, and other publications are far too various to mention here, but just trust me, she's the real deal. So, Manisha, I'm so happy to host you this evening and talk about your exciting and timely new book. And at this case, I would just like to hand over the presentation to you, and Manisha is going to give us a short overview of her work, and then we're going to transition to a Q&A between her and I, or her and me, and then we will have questions open to the audience as well via the chat function that we can go through with her as well. So thank you so much, Manisha.
Thank you, Vaughn, for that kind introduction. And I've been told that I should talk a little bit about my book before we chat and open it up to the audience. So I'm happy to do that. I will share my screen with you so you have a sense of what I am talking about. Here we go. Let's make this a slideshow. Good. So, as you can see, I'm going to be talking about my new book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, which looks at this period of Reconstruction immediately after the Civil War. And of course, the crucial question of Reconstruction has always been that, how did interracial democracy progress under the revolutionary impetus of the Civil War and emancipation? And how did it come apart so quickly? Because that period of Reconstruction actually birthed a national citizenship. It expanded the boundaries of political belonging, rights, and claims on the nation state, building, quote, a composite nation, as the Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass put it, was the greatest challenge of what I call the Second American Republic. It was to build up Black citizenship in the South after the war and to establish an interracial democracy. Now, of course, this was a very fraught and contested project in the South. During the Civil War itself, hundreds of thousands of people lost their life. And due to low-grade domestic terrorism in the South, many others lost their lives and rights while trying to fight for Black equality in the South. So I was really interested in looking not just at the achievements of Reconstruction, but also at the sort of new regime of racist terror that was put into place after Reconstruction was overthrown. We also see that this sort of move against democracy in the South becomes kind of national because this is the same time when the women's suffrage movement fails. It's the same time when Asian immigrants are systematically excluded. So within this large frame, I'm looking at also the conquest of the West and the ways in which the rights of labor are also being compromised in the North with the takeoff of industrial capitalism. So when we look at this fundamental question of Reconstruction, which is, who is the citizen? And what is the role of the government in expanding rights or sovereignty? Those are the sort of broad questions that my book is very much interested in. Now, we know that, in fact, democracy in the United States has always been rigorously challenged by forces of political and economic reaction. So the overthrow of Reconstruction and the conditions of labor that followed throughout the nation in the West and the North also made a mockery of the free labor ideology of the victorious North. We had new dreams of empire, especially after the conquest of the Western Indian nation. And by the end of the 19th century, the American Republic was a full-fledged formal empire as it acquired colonies from the Caribbean to the Philippines after the Spanish-American-Cuban War of 1898. So the demise of the Second American Republic or Reconstruction inaugurated an era of hierarchy and inequality within the country and outside, racial, ethnic, gendered, and economic, rather than the one of equal citizenship promised by the War for Emancipation and Reconstruction. So, unlike previous books that sort of begin with 1865, previous books on Reconstruction, and conclude in 1877 with the overthrow of the last Reconstruction state governments in the South, I argue that we really need to pay a lot of attention to the period after 1877 too, to completely understand how Reconstruction was overthrown and unraveled during this period. And it can tell us much about the afterlives of slavery, the persistence of unfree labor and social hierarchies and economic inequality, and the global race for empire, which the United States joined by the end of the 19th century. So, connecting the struggle for Black citizenship in the South with other debates over ethnicity, gender, economic autonomy, and sovereignty that raged at the same time, I argue that we have missed much by confining our vision of the end of Reconstruction to the South. So it is a compelling example to show how American democracy and even representative government, established by the first Constitution with the founding of the first American Republic, can unravel for long periods of time. So not only is the chronology and scope of my book, but its interpretation, which is at odds with conventional historical narratives, that have emphasized how the United States was able to establish a long-lasting experiment in representative government by expanding rights and democracy incrementally and slowly to all groups previously excluded. Now, in this prevailing view, the Anglo-American tradition of liberal democracy is more distinct from the more volatile histories of continental Europe and the rest of the Americas, Latin America. That's how the story goes, from simple stories of American exceptionalism to more sophisticated analyses of democracy in the Western world. This sort of view of American history cannot, in fact, explain the violent upheavals of the mid to late 19th century. The Civil War itself, in which more Americans died than the First, Second World War, the Vietnam and the Korean Wars combined. And in fact, also Reconstruction and its brutal and violent overthrow in the South. As President Abraham Lincoln put it in December 1862, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. So I argue that the Civil War resulted in the destruction of the first American Republic and birthed the second. And my notion of a second American Republic comes from the history of French republicanism, where republics have risen and fallen. In fact, the French are now on their fifth republic. They've also established new constitutions. So maybe the match is not exact. But the notion that republicanism, with a small r, in the United States can rise and fall and can be upended for long periods of time is something that I think we need to think about by looking at the history of republics elsewhere also. Because we can see during Reconstruction the growth of a kind of reactionary authoritarian politics in the South that we normally associate with other countries and not with the United States. So, to put it simply, the long afterlives of slavery and imperialism are as important to understanding United States history as our more familiar ameliorative tales about the abolition of slavery and the expansion of democracy and citizenship rights during Reconstruction. So, what I try to argue in my book is that we need to look at American history not simply as a linear progressive thing with the progress of democracy and freedom, but look at the ways in which it can be overthrown, as it was with the destruction of Reconstruction. At the same time, I want to distinguish this idea that American history is somehow only the history of racist reaction, because it isn't. In fact, if you look at the history of Reconstruction and US history as a whole, what we get is what I call the great conflict or contestation between democratic ideas and more reactionary ideas, more exclusionary ideas about who is a citizen and who is properly uh, um, eligible to get rights and privileges in our democracy. So I really do like to emphasize the emancipatory moment that the Civil War and Reconstruction represented in American history, its significant legacy of progressive constitutionalism and democratic governance that remains important down to our times, the novel notion that the government, the federal government in this case, is responsible for expanding the rights and maintaining the welfare of all its citizens, regardless of color and previous conditions of servitude, and to really see Reconstruction as this moment when the anti slavery state was able to establish an interracial democracy in the South. Now, this is a moment in American history, what I call the Second American Republic, when anti-slavery and republicanism, again with a small r, representative government, Republican government combined. And the Republican Party of the 19th century at that time, the party of Lincoln, represented this movement. And this was connected to developments across the Americas. We don't normally think of it in that manner, but we need to. For instance, when the Civil War began in the United States, the Mexican Republic was also overthrown by the French, and an emperor was installed in Mexico. And it's not until 1866 that that emperor is overthrown and the Mexican Republic is reborn. Similarly, the Spanish invaded the Dominican Republic and tried to annex it back into the Spanish Empire. So the forces of reaction were always there. And the Union, of course, supported Republican forces. The Confederates were quite in cahoots with the forces of the ancien regime, with monarchical governments. Lincoln himself was very aware about the spread of anti-slavery and republicanism. He supported the Argentinian Republic when it came together after its own civil war and finally ended slavery there. The year he issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 is also the year that the Dutch inaugurated a process of gradual emancipation. And at the end of the Civil War, of course, we get the remaking of the US Constitution with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The most important and consequential of these are the 14th Amendment. And in fact, I think that if we simply enforce the 14th Amendment, its anti-insurrection clause, its anti-voter suppression clause, its recognizing that all citizens should enjoy the equal protections of the law and the due process of the law as a national standard, its establishment of national birthright citizenship, which many people today criticize. And also, of course, its idea that the debt of the United States should be honored and that should never be questioned. If even implemented some of these far-reaching clauses of the 14th Amendment, we would be in a better place today. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment, which gave Black men the right to vote. So the 1860s and 1870s is very important, not just in terms of the demise of slavery and the establishment of Black citizenship in the United States during Reconstruction. It's also the time when what scholars have called the second slavery of the 19th century is being challenged and comes to an end because of what's happening in the United States. Um, this is where you have only three big societies in the Americas that still have slavery in the 19th century: Cuba, Brazil, and the United States South. And once it unravels in the South, it unravels in Cuba and Brazil too. They have their own wars, the Cuban War for Independence, that had many Afro-Cuban generals, one of them is pictured here, Antonio Maceo Grajales, and I just put his picture up there because many freed people in the South would name their sons Maceo after this particular Afro-Cuban general. There was the Triple Alliance War in Brazil, which also destabilized slavery. Many enslaved people looked to Lincoln and the Civil War and Reconstruction as a model. By 1870, 1871, Cuba and Brazil also passed what were known as free womb laws. They freed children of the enslaved, the way the northern states had done after the American Civil War. And the Spanish Empire abolishes slavery in Puerto Rico first in 1873, and then very belatedly in Cuba in 1886 after putting down the War for Independence. Brazil also comes belatedly to emancipation. The 1880s, these emancipations are very sort of half-hearted. They take place under the shadow of the defeat of Reconstruction and Black rights in the United States. So this, if we look at Reconstruction in a transnational way, if we look at what's happening in other places, we understand that what happens in the United States in terms of the transition from slavery to freedom is also happening in Cuba and Brazil in the 19th century. Now, the one way that the scope of my book is very different than most traditional books on Reconstruction is that, I really do pay attention to this period between 1877 and 1890. Most Reconstruction historians believe that in 1877 there was a compromise that put the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes into the presidency and resulted in the fall of the last Reconstruction governments in the South, in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. But historians today question whether there was even a formal compromise. What we do know is that these things did, in fact, happen. Whether there was a deal or not is something that historians continue to debate. But what I'm trying to argue here is that we need to look beyond 1877 too, and look at the way Reconstruction unraveled between 1877 and 1890, and really see the 1890s as a crucial decade when Reconstruction was completely overthrown. So we need to look at this gradual unwinding rather than simply stop at 1877. And then we see how in the 1890s, many things happen in the South that coincide with other things that are happening in the North and West and lead to severe challenges for American democracy. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, Black men are really disfranchised formally, only starting with Mississippi in 1890, and then quickly other southern states have, followed the Mississippi and, you know, um, come up with new state constitutions that get rid of Black male suffrage. You also have, of course, the Wounded Knee Massacre of the Lakota people in the West. It's the death knell of Indian sovereignty in the Western Plains. Um, of course, in the 1890s, you get the putting in place of a regime of racial segregation, Black disfranchisement, a convict lease labor system, an upsurge in racial violence in terms of lynchings and racial massacres. And the Supreme Court basically greenlights this. We all know Plessy versus Ferguson, but there are a number of other decisions that the Supreme Court makes at this time that really kneecaps Reconstruction and American democracy. This is also when the push for American empire begins with the Spanish-Cuban-American War of 1898. And I have put this illustration here because these are the men who are involved in overthrowing some of the last interracial governments in the Upper South, in North Carolina, and in the city of Wilmington, where they take part in a massacre and overthrow the city government through a violent coup. We don't think this has happened in American history, but it actually happens in Wilmington, and hundreds of African Americans are murdered in this coup. What's interesting about these men is that many of them belonged to the Wilmington Light Infantry that had taken part in the Spanish-Cuban American War. And here, of course, the United States ends up not conquering Cuba, but severely compromising Cuban sovereignty. It also ends up annexing Hawaii and acquires the Philippines as a colony. And so this is a real change. You go from a republic to an empire. So, in this broad story that I tell in this book, this is the second half of the book that simply talks about this unwinding, but it also ends with the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which was modeled after the 15th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment, of course, gave women the right to vote in 1920. And I argue that we need to look at the 19th Amendment as a Reconstruction Amendment because it was modeled after the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. So, of course, there can be no doubt that the Reconstruction of the misbegotten Southern Confederacy transformed the US Constitution, and that it actually bequeathed to us the legacy of our modern democracy. The 14th Amendment was misinterpreted by the US Supreme Court for a very long time, used to protect the rights of corporations during the Gilded Age rather than that of freed people. But in our modern times, it has increasingly been used to expand rights rather than constrict them. Some of the decisions like Roe v. Wade actually came out of the 14th Amendment. Of course, now that no longer is the law of the land. So many of the issues of Reconstruction continue to bedevil us today. And I think it's really important to understand that Reconstruction gives us our modern day political legacies of both the modern state, but also a kind of a reactionary backlash to the creation of a strong nation state, to the creation of national birthright citizenship, regardless of color and previous condition of servitude. Those are the exact words that I'm lifting from the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. Um, we must understand that the defeat of Black freedom with the overthrow of Reconstruction was also the defeat of American democracy. And Reconstruction reveals to us that democracy, including Republican government in the United States, can be systematically overthrown for long periods. And it's only with the rise of the civil rights movement that many of the Reconstruction laws and amendments are actually implemented. I don't have time to go into all those details, but I would be happy to talk about it with Vaughn and then with you in the Q&A. Thanks so much for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much. That's fascinating. And it really is a great reflection, I think, of the breadth and the depth of this book. Um, so I always like starting books now looking at the acknowledgments. And I really like your acknowledgments. I thought they were really personal and gave some good insight. And I really liked your anecdote about grad school in your acknowledgments. For any of us who've gone through grad school, it's an experience. I was lucky; I had a great grad school experience. But could you talk a little bit about your experience in graduate school and how you think it's kind of shaped your career? Because you have a clear trajectory in your books and everything, but how did your graduate school experience affect or shape that? The questions, the big questions you ask, and the way you approach the profession of history.
So you're a lot like me, Vaughn. I tend to read the acknowledgements first too in any book
Yeah.
that I read
So
because
all the
it
good, yeah.
kind of gives you a window into a person's sort of scholarly trajectory and what has influenced them. And I went to graduate school, as you noted earlier, to Columbia University. And my first year in the doctoral program there, my advisor, my mentor was Eric Foner, and he was finishing up his big book on Reconstruction. And I did my first presentation on his manuscript, which at that time was over 1,000 pages. When I did that, I never thought I would write a book on Reconstruction, to tell you the truth. That book is amazing. It's a wonderful book on Reconstruction. It was written in the 1980s, of course, published then, but it is still pretty much the gold standard when it comes to the history of Reconstruction. And then when I started writing my book, I did not see my book as replacing that book, but I see it more as a sort of a sequel to it, because there are many things that I agree with Eric Foner. His emphasis on what an amazing experiment in interracial democracy Reconstruction was in the South immediately after the end of slavery. It's pretty unprecedented. That is something that I'm very much in sympathy with, and he was overturning all these biased views of Reconstruction that had been put into place by academic historians, but even in popular culture in the South, where it was often associated with the lost cause mythology of the Civil War as a terrible time of corruption and black misrule, etc. And Fona really highlighted the achievements. I think the way my book goes a bit beyond his book is to look at what I just talked about, the unraveling of Reconstruction, but also look at women's history. And look at the ways in which the history of Reconstruction connects with other things that are happening in the country. He himself did pay attention to changes in the North, for instance, at this time. But I think we could do much more with the conquest of the West and the rise of American imperialism, because a lot of that was based on pro-slavery ideas of empire in the 1850s. So when we say the North won the war and the South won the peace, it was not just in terms of Jim Crow, but also in terms of national policy, in terms of seeing all non-white peoples as basically being incapable of self-government. That they had proved that somehow in the South, and they were going to continue to do that. And that's why I say that we should look at American history as these contending forces, because it has never been all one or the other. It's always been in conflict, and our present day political ideas and conflicts are very much shaped by what happened then.
Yes. Yeah, I think that was a great reply. And you actually hit something else I was going to ask. It was about Phoner, because of course, yeah. Uh, I think though, going off with what you just finished up with, there is this idea of how much this book has to say about our present. It's a very timely book. It's something. It's one of the main reasons I was so drawn to this book when I started looking at books to invite. And as you mentioned, I'll quote you on the book focuses on the debate over who is a citizen and the role of the state in expanding or constricting rights and indigenous sovereignty. Its primary theme is the ongoing tension between democracy and capitalism, with the latter's historical entanglement in slavery and imperialism. Now, you also finish up your acknowledgments by mentioning that your son has just gone off to university. And what would you want a college age person, a young person in America right now to really take away from this book? Like, what are some one or two, like the key, really like core nuggets if that you'd want your son to take away from this book?
What a great question. I really did write this book for the average American student and citizen, because I think we somehow forget how history informs our present. And I wrote this book, and I wrote it in a manner to reach the widest audience possible. It'd be great if undergraduates read it too. Um, if my son was reading it, I would want him, he's 18, he's going to be voting for the first time
Yep.
in the presidential elections. And then two, three things that I want people to really think hard about. One is the notion that we somehow think that we have certain ideas about equality and democracy, and that somehow that is something new,
Mhm.
that is current and that is present, that did not happen in the past. Actually, from the moment the first American Republic is founded, there were people who had ideas about democracy, equality, fighting against slavery right from the start. You
Mhm.
could just begin with Lincoln's speeches. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, I think every American citizen should read all of Lincoln because he really very evocatively talked about the problems of slavery and democracy and what the future of the American Republic should be. So that's one thing that I want young people to know, that many of the issues that they are interested in or fighting about actually have their antecedents in the past. The second thing that I want people to understand is that when disfranchised groups, like for instance, women who did not have the right to vote, or even enslaved people who had to struggle mightily to get basic civil rights and political rights, that just because they're disfranchised, that does not mean that they have not been important actors in the growth of American democracy. After Lincoln's assassination, you get one of the worst presidents in US history, Andrew Johnson, a man who could not comprehend the results of the Civil War and who really fanned the fires of racial hatred in the South and made Southerners feel unrepentant, even though they had lost the war. They continued fighting for their quote lost cause. I want people to understand that history can go backwards very fast. And that it really takes ordinary citizens to struggle for expanding our boundaries of citizenship, belonging, and democracy. The third thing that I want people to understand is the way in which Reconstruction created the modern American state. We often think of the New Deal that expanded the federal government and many federal programs as the rise of the modern liberal state in the United States. But this notion that the federal government owes a responsibility to its most vulnerable and weak citizens to guarantee them, a certain amount of protection and relief comes about during Reconstruction. You have the formation of the first big federal government agency, the Freedmen's Bureau. You have the foundation of the Department of Justice. People want a Department of Education. You have the foundation of the Department of Agriculture. The federal government grows. And Southerners mix their critique of what they call big government, even then, with a kind of a racist reactionary agenda in the South. But we think of the social state or the modern state as somehow foreign to the American political tradition, and it isn't. It's because we don't know the history of Reconstruction. If you look at the history of Reconstruction and you look at what the Freedmen's Bureau did in terms of giving relief, not just to former slaves, but to poor Southern whites devastated by the Civil War, you get a very different picture of the rise of the social state. This is when historically Black colleges and universities are founded all over the country, not just the South, because Black people had been denied access to equal education, certainly under slavery. But even free Black people were often hounded out violently at times from white educational institutions. And these historically Black colleges and universities are still around today, but they were founded during Reconstruction. So this notion that government owes it to its citizens to provide them with education. Many people in the South don't know this, but the public school systems that were founded in New England and the North were founded in the South only during Reconstruction. The South didn't have a public school system. The rich, the slaveholders, etc., could give their children private school education. You didn't have public schools. And it is from that time onwards that reactionaries and conservatives in the South start criticizing public education. They start criticizing being taxed for public schools, for orphans, for asylums, and all the other services that are needed for the most vulnerable in our society. So these political debates and controversies began during Reconstruction, and they continue until today in the South and the nation as a whole. Those are the things I want people to, those are the three,
Yeah,
four things I want my son and the average American student or the citizen to take away from the book.
that's fantastic. Yeah, and you're very intentional in this, and I think that really shines through whether in your presentation or you're answering these questions. And another thing on that intentionality is that I like your section on terminology in the beginning, being very specific about what kind of words you're using and what you mean by those words, because words, of course, can have so much power. So why did you think it was so important to include this section in your book, and what does it tell us about the historical profession as a whole, or in our nation, for that matter?
You know, the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction had been so misrepresented by historians like the Dunning School from my alma mater,
Hmm.
Columbia, and uh, they use pejorative terms, which already loads the dice when you're trying to understand a period. So Northern Republicans were called carpetbaggers. Southern Unionists were called scalawags or rascals or traitors, right? And I didn't want to use those terms, even though they're used by Reconstruction historians. It perpetuated what W.E.B. Du Bois called, quote, the propaganda of history. Many of these Southerners, mainly Southern historians, who were writing histories of the Civil War, writing histories of Reconstruction in a way to rehabilitate what General Ulysses Grant called the worst cause in the history of mankind when you were fighting to enslave others. This was not some innocuous Southern heritage or honor. And I didn't want to use those terms. I also didn't want to call Johnson's plan presidential reconstruction because Johnson didn't want any reconstruction. He wanted to simply restore the status quo antebellum before the war without slavery, where Black people would have absolutely no rights, which a white person is bound to respect. And in that sense, he was completely out of tune with the main forces of Reconstruction. We had somewhat of a wartime and presidential Reconstruction under President Abraham Lincoln, arguably the greatest president in United States history. And I do these C-SPAN polls that they have historians and political scientists do. There you have to rate presidents, and you
Hmm.
know Lincoln and Washington always win the race, no matter what, and they have been for the last few years. But in any case, I wanted to talk about presidential reconstruction as involving Lincoln's plans and not Johnson's plans. I called it a restoration, not presidential reconstruction. So I wanted to explain that, and that's why I have that note on terminology right from the start, where I say that in order to understand the achievements of Reconstruction fully, we also have to do away with this sort of propaganda that many Southern historians and Southern writers in the late 19th century. This is exactly the time when they started building these monumental statues to Confederate generals throughout the South. It litters through, the Southern countryside. You have people like the Sons of Confederacy, the Daughters of the Confederacy, writing Southern history textbooks, putting up these statues, and it's a real misrepresentation of both the war and Reconstruction. And it pervades popular culture, Hollywood movies, novels, etc. And so it's been a long and hard battle for historians uh, to write against this. And it began when, Nazism made racism unpopular during the Second World War, but really came into its own with the triumph of the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. So I felt we needed new terminology. We needed to use the terms that people use to describe themselves rather than pejorative terms invented by many of these Southern writers and historians who wanted to justify the regime of Jim Crow and the disfranchisement of Black people.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm going to make an announcement here. We have a Q&A section, and I'm going to start reading some of your audience questions along with my own. And we have one right now from Michael Rosnow. Manisha asks, I'm curious if the author can speak a bit more about the relationships between Reconstruction, empire, and industrialization. The talk emphasized empire's role in overthrowing democracy. What role do you see the rise of industrial capitalism playing in this process?
That's a great question, Michael. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about, there's a whole chapter called The Reign of Capital, talking about the industrial takeoff in the United States, which comes a little later than in Britain. Britain had already experienced its turn towards industrial capitalism earlier. But it's between 1870 and 1920 that the industrial takeoff really takes, you have the rise of railroad corporations, you have the rise of big industries and manufacturing all over the country, including in the south with extractive industries, mining, etc., and the revival of the plantation economy, which is supplying cotton to all these industrial mills both in Britain and the United States. So this is really important to understand in terms of the transformation of the Republican Party and the way the Republican Party, the federal government, and the North abandons Reconstruction, and also the ways in which Northern elites, particularly business elites, start sympathizing with Southern elites who complain about Black labor, people who didn't want to work like slaves anymore. You have the great railroad strikes, tremendous labor strife that accompanies industrial capitalism in the North. And many northern elites are very sympathetic to the plight of southern planters and merchants and manufacturers. They start investing also in the southern economy, and they want tractable labor both in the south and north. And so you get this retreat from Reconstruction with many of these corporations expounding what we today call political conservatism, but which is really classical liberalism, laissez-faire ideas that the government should not interfere in the society and economy. There should be no regulations, both in terms of safety, workers, wages, nothing. Let industry titans basically decide what they want to do. Many big tech companies today, it seems their owners want to do the same thing, take us back there. And so the Republican Party gradually is transforming at this time from the party of anti-slavery and Reconstruction into the party of the Gilded Age, into the party of big business. And this movement in the Republican Party is represented by the so-called liberal Republicans. Liberal not in the sense of modern liberalism as we understand it today, but as I said earlier, classical laissez-faire liberalism. They don't want government to intervene in the South with Reconstruction. They don't want government to intervene in the North with regulating the hours and safety conditions of workers. And this is the formation of the modern Republican Party. I think you could see how the Republican Party completely abandons its anti-slavery origins and its commitment to Black rights and citizenship, and gradually gets transformed into a far more conservative, pro-business party, which reached its height in the 1920s. And the Democratic Party, which is the party of, the South, the party of white supremacy in the South, gradually gets transformed into a more progressive party. With the New Deal and with the civil rights movement, of course, it becomes the party of Black rights. So you literally have a flip. And I think to understand that flip, you have to understand the triumph of industrial capitalism in the North. Um, we must remember that at the eve of the Civil War, the North was as agrarian as the South. So the old Beardian interpretation that somehow it was a war between the agrarian South versus the industrial North, with slavery not having much of a place in the conflict between the sections, is simply incorrect, because that industrial takeoff actually took place much later. So it's a very crucial part of the story on why the North abandons freed people and abandons Reconstruction in the South.
That's a great answer. Wow. I have a question for me. So you're obviously covering a lot of ground in this book, both thematically, temporally, uh, you know, of course, time and space, geographically. But you also do a good job of bringing humans into this. As you start your book off with a narrative of the murder of Amy Circuit, which of course is a brutal but not necessarily unique instance in American history. But if you were to like, if you and you do a great job of foregrounding people, underrepresented peoples in American history to this pretty widely covered time period. But if you had to have like main characters of this work, would you have them? I mean, who would maybe be some of your main characters, would you say? It doesn't mean they have to have the most, quote, screen time in the book, but like who do you think some of the most representative figures are of what you're trying to say?
So I really do have some of my favorite characters from this
Okay.
period. Lincoln, of course, I've talked
Yes.
about him, but the radical Republicans, Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, really are standouts in terms of implementing Reconstruction in the South. They're amazing men, they're radicals, they're abolitionists who are sincerely committed to Black rights. They even imagine redistributing land from the plantations to Black people and breaking up the power of Southern plantation owners, many of them large slaveholders, many of them extreme secessionists who had led the movement for secession and had dominated the Confederacy. And so if their plans had been implemented, it would have changed the face of Southern society. It would have been truly revolutionary, and it would have put Reconstruction on a very strong basis. So those two men are my favorite people. I began this book thinking I would write a dual biography of them. It became into a big book on Reconstruction. I also think some of the women are neglected, and some of my favorite women who fought for not only women's suffrage, but also for Black rights at this time. They were old abolitionist feminists like Lucy Stone, who's one of my favorite people. Like me, she refused to take her husband's name when she got married, which in the 19th century was regarded as quite revolutionary. And when, women in the 1920s started doing that, they called themselves stoners, not stoners as you understand them, but as Lucy Stoners. And Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a Black abolitionist feminist who insisted that white suffragists think about Black rights too when they fight for women's suffrage. She thought that these things were interconnected. Today we use the term intersectionality to describe people who fight for the rights of different groups, Black people, immigrants, women, other people who may be discriminated against. But Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was one of the first to argue that Black rights must intersect with white women's rights, and that if you just have a suffrage movement, pure and simple, that does not look at the issues that confront Black women, then it would be an incomplete movement. So she's one of my favorite people. Some of the later social feminists like Jane Addams and Florence Kelly are just outstanding because they're fighting for women's suffrage, for labor rights, for immigrant rights, and they're pacifists. They're against wars of empire that directly leads actually to the First World War. And later on, its fallout leads to the Second World War. So they're pacifists. They're very concerned with all kinds of problems that beset society. And many of these women worked before women had the right to vote. So they're outstanding figures. I was also really struck by some of the Native American leaders who put up a huge fight to defend their sovereignty. And people like Captain Jack Kinposh, he was from the Modoc Nation, or Sitting Bull, or Geronimo, the Chiricahua Apache leader. They really fought for their sovereignty right until the end. And if you see things from their perspective, you realize that the conquest of the West were also wars of empire because they were fought the way Europeans fought for empire in Asia and Africa. And the kinds of forced acculturations that took place of the Indian peoples were very similar to what the Europeans tried in their colonies. And so I was very taken by some of these very brave and strong Native American leaders who continue to fight for their sovereignty in the worst of circumstances. And last but not least, the labor leaders. Somebody asked that question about industrial capitalism. I was very impressed by the abolitionists who continue to support Black rights, but also fought against Chinese exclusion, who fought against um, fought for the 8-hour day for working class people. People like Garrison, Wendell Phillips in particular, who thought that he had fought against Black slavery and he was going to fight against wage slavery, against reducing white labor to slave-like conditions. They were union men. They believed in strikes. They believed in workers asserting their rights. They felt that in a republic, gross economic inequality would threaten democracy. And in a way, they were right about that too. So I know you asked me for a few, but it's a big book with many different issues.
Yeah.
And I have many of my heroes in this book. So I put them all
I,
in.
I love that. And it comes through. And, it's, I really like that you include the, genocidal treatment of Native American peoples as a part of the story of Reconstruction, because of course the American Civil War unfolded on native land. And you also mentioned, presidents, George Washington, of course, their first imperial push. He spent his whole adult life trying to take Native Americans' land away from them, whether as a young British soldier or the commander of the American forces in the Revolutionary War, or as the first president. So yeah, I think that's excellent. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Are there lessons from Reconstruction we can apply to overcome the reactionary responses that are applicable today? So there are lessons from
Yeah.
Reconstruction
So,
we can apply today.
yeah. I do think that we are wrestling with many of the same issues. The very fact that the 14th Amendment was evoked in many recent Supreme Court cases,
Mhm.
the insurrection case, other cases, shows you that those questions are still alive and well. And if you look at Reconstruction and you look at the way racist demagogues try to rile up racial hatred to undo Reconstruction, we still have that going on today where people are being scapegoated and victimized with false accusations. I mean, African American men were lynched, thousands of them were lynched because of false accusations that somehow they were all criminals and rapists,
Mhm.
even that they were cannibals. Now we have people eating pet animals or some whatever. So these are very age-old tactics in American history, and we frankly should not be going back there. We should be disavowing them. We've achieved a lot as a nation since Reconstruction. But I think, as I said, many of those ideas of the federal government as a guarantor of voting and civil rights across the nation is something that comes up during Reconstruction, and we need to move ahead with that. At this point, when we have crises in democracy with the rise of the global authoritarian right, and its own homegrown versions in our country, I think we have to be mindful of the lessons of Reconstruction. What are the ways that we can avoid some of the pitfalls? I certainly don't want to write about the downfall of the Third American Republic, which really, if you think about it, the second reconstruction of American democracy was the civil rights movement. And many of them were implementing laws and ideas from 100 years ago. So we don't want to be in the situation where we repeat that cycle, where reactionary backlash can take us back to a time that I think most modern American citizens don't want to go back to. And this is not to say that, of course, as you said earlier, the American Republic is founded on the dispossession of Native Americans, but that is what we have today. That is our experiment in Republican government and our constitutional order. And I think that's worth fighting for, especially on the eve of the 250th anniversary of the founding of the American Republic.
Sure. Excellent. Kay has a question. What are your opinions or your take on the role of the Rockefeller family in the early 20th century? I think, and that came in after you were talking about some of like industrialism, big business, that kind of thing.
Yeah, of course, the Rockefellers, pioneered monopoly capitalism. Many of these big railroad corporations and capitalists were against government interference in the economy when it came to protecting the rights of labor and consumers. But they really benefited from what we would call today welfare capitalism.
Mhm.
They wanted the government on their side. If there was a strike, they wanted federal troops there to shoot at the strikers. If there were a law passed by a state government or by the federal government on regulating wages and hours, they wanted the Supreme Court to overturn it, which the a very reactionary Supreme Court obliged them. So we have similar situation today, and as far as that is concerned, too. I do think we do need to, as I said, look back at Reconstruction and look at the ways in which big magnates like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, etc., the Mellons, one of the scions of the Mellon dynasty is still around, and he is subsidizing right-wing authoritarian movements today in the United States. So, history is now past. It lives on. Um, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, despite all the havoc that they, created, they were also the robber barons who created wealth for themselves, unimaginable wealth themselves. They also invested a lot in philanthropy to sort of rescue their own reputations. I myself have benefited from grants from the Mellon Foundation, from the Rockefeller Foundations, etc. So they did put their money to some good use. But I think the lesson is that in a republic, as the founders themselves put it, gross economic inequality is not good. That is what would threaten the continued existence of a republic when extremely rich plutocrats, as they were called during the Gilded Age, feel that they're somehow above the law and that they have the right to decide who should be in charge of us. That's not the American way. It's not the American system of representative government. The people should decide, and not a handful of rich people. Now, thanks to a very bad decision by the United States Supreme Court, Citizens United, we have the unchecked flow of money in our elections. But it all goes back to some of these magnates from the Gilded Age, people like the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Mellons.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So we have 2 minutes here, and so I'm gonna wrap up with a kind of a, and then you don't have to answer this. This is a difficult but open. What's next? Do you know? Because I mean, we spent a long time on these works. Do you want to say? Do you have any ideas, or are you just kind of sitting with this for now?
Well, in my profession, it's publish or perish.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And I feel, as I grow older, that I want to write the books I want to write, right? I feel at this stage I can do that.
Mhm.
And my next project is a history of feminism, especially because I see so much polarization along gendered lines now, and so much contestation over women's rights. And I've written a lot about that in my book on abolition, the first women's rights movement, how it emerged out of the abolition movement in the mid 19th century, and then with this last book, the suffrage movement, and some of the problems they confronted, how they divided over the issue of race during Reconstruction. Um, so I started thinking about this, and I said, why not write a sort of history of feminism, and look at how this whole contestation over women's rights, just as over Black rights that I've written earlier, has really shaped our democracy and some of the issues we confront today.
Fantastic. I think, yeah, I look forward to that. I can see the seeds of it in this book as well. So, well, thank you so much. We're at 7:30 now. So thank you so much, Manisha, and thank you everyone who came. Uh, and yeah, I guess we will